The first thing that I want to do this morning is to kind of talk about what is the California Girls Collaborative. And we are actually one of the replication sites for the National Girls Project. And rather than me talking and missing any salient points, we're going to show you a movie clip, which I think goes over all that very well.
The Northwest Girls Collaborative Project strives to bring more young women into science, technology, engineering, and mathematics careers, also known as STEM, by helping organizations collaborate to inform and motivate girls to pursue careers in STEM-related fields. The National Science Foundation funded this 18-month grant, which is being administered in Washington and Oregon by the Diversity and Technology Group at the Puget Sound Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology.
Our initial interest in the grant was sparked by a concern over the minimal number of young women going into STEM fields, that is, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. According to a recent study done by the National Council for Research on Women, less than 20% of degrees in these fields were awarded to young women. And our initial and major goal was to increase that number. When we began looking at the situation specifically in Washington and Oregon, we discovered that there were already numerous organizations that were committed to encouraging and involving girls in activities related to STEM. But rather than collaborating and cooperating with each other in presenting these programs, many of the organizations seem to be competing both for access to girls and for access to what seemed to be diminishing supportive resources. So our goal was to identify these programs, to introduce the coordinators and the groups involved in supporting these programs, and to provide a context for some creative collaboration between these groups.
The strength of the Northwest Girls Collaborative Project is directly related to the strength of the partnerships within the project.
It's a real pleasure for Washington Mesa to be one of the lead partners in the Northwest Girls Collaborative Project. Washington Mesa is designed to increase the number of African American, Latino, and Native American students in math, science, engineering, technology fields. We are very encouraged by the National Science Foundation's support for this project to bring girl-serving organizations together.
The Northwest Regional Educational Laboratory in Oregon is collaborating with the Puget Sound Center on Teaching, Learning, and Technology in Washington to develop the Northwest Girls Collaborative Project. The project is designed to encourage young women to consider fields in math, science, engineering, and technology. And we're working with organizations who deliver those services to help them collaborate across state lines.
As we were developing the project, we realized that we needed a group of leaders to champion the project and to help move it along and to increase the awareness of the project. So we asked for leaders from business and industry such as Microsoft, and Boeing, and Intel, K-12 and higher education, so the University of Washington, the Evergreen State College, Bellevue Community College, the Oregon Institute of Technology, and the Oregon Education Association. Community-based organizations, for example, OMSI, the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, has played a major role in this project, and professional organizations such as science teachers. And all of these wonderful people have made a huge difference in the success of our project.
It's important for corporations like Microsoft to get involved in the collaborative because it enables us to reach out to the community. Microsoft recognizes that there aren't enough women in technology, and we need to reach out to girls at a young age to get them interested in science, technology, engineering, and math. And if we don't do it now, we're still going to be in the same predicament in the future.
The project itself is a great way between the websites and face-to-face, and then of course the newsletters that go out, hey, here's an opportunity. It's really done a lot to go forward to bring a lot of different organizations together, which is just, it's great, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so happy to be involved with it.
The Northwest Girls Collaborative Project components include conferences and forums, a website, e-newsletters, mini-grants, and development of a program evaluation tool.
Initially, we held kickoff conferences in each state to bring together the program coordinators and to talk to them about their major needs and concerns. Currently, we're working with over 90 programs in the 2 states. In response to the input we got at the 2 kickoff conferences, we hosted 3 forums. The first one was on collaboration strategies. The second one was on program evaluation techniques. And most recently, we had a forum on mentoring strategies, how to establish mentoring programs for girls.
We've designed a rich project website that includes listings of over 100 organizations, girl-serving organizations. We've asked them to fill in their needs and resources, and we call that the Resource Center for that reason. And then what we do is we actually do sort of a matchmaking process where organizations can see what other organizations have to offer or need, and hopefully they connect with each other, and we've helped them through our forums and conferences to collaborate and work together.
The Northwest Girls Collaborative Project has awarded over 20 mini grants, and the purpose of the mini grants is to help organizations collaborate.
We had a mini grant with the Business Education Compact here in Portland, and they were working with Native American youth, and they put high school girls into internship programs for the summer. And through our mini grant, we were able to take 3 high school girls that were Native Americans and place them in full-time positions, almost full-time positions for the summer, and they were able to work in our Earth Science Hall, our Life Science Hall, and our Featured Exhibit Hall, to work on projects within the hall, to be mentored by a female staff, and to give science demonstrations.
One of the components of the Northwest Girls Collaborative Project is to develop a program evaluation tool for programs to use. A program evaluation tool is a way for programs to measure their effectiveness. And this helps programs to both see what they are doing that is successful and things that maybe could use some improvement. And so it's informative to the program development, as well as it's a way to show outcomes to outside agencies. For instance, if you want to garner support from the community for your program, or if you want to convince funders that you're doing something that's worthwhile, if you want to just show your board what you're accomplishing. So there are a variety of uses for the program evaluation tool.
This project has been so successful over the 18-month period that we're hoping that we can take it nationwide and help other regions form collaborative partnerships and help even more girls and girl-serving organizations come together.
I would love to see the Northwest Girls Collaborative Project expanded to be a more national type of program. I think the opportunities to work together is something that's needed anywhere, and to have a vehicle such as this, something that is so simple and yet so effective in bringing people together to share ideas and to capitalize on each other's resources. This is something that I think could be easily shared nationally in lots of different environments and for lots of different purposes.
We're one of 4 project replication sites. There's also Massachusetts, Texas, Wisconsin, and California. So similar activities are happening throughout the country. And once again, I don't want to speak too much at length, but the key thing here today is about collaboration. That's the key word to keep in your mind. What are we here for? We're here for collaboration. You're here to meet other groups. You're here to leverage resources, to find new opportunities, all through collaboration. And before we go into that portion of it, I think what Dr. Levine said is so important. You know, how do we know what we know, and what do we really know about these issues of supporting and encouraging girls and women in STEM? And so, oddly enough, the last time we had a meeting here at Davis was on a very cold, I think January morning. Very cold. It's kind of a joke around here. But it was the day after President Summers of Harvard made his now infamous comments. And it was so appropriate that we should be holding our meeting on that day. And no sooner had I gotten home than one of my colleagues at the University of California Medical Center in San Francisco said, "Stan, I think we really have a person that you should become involved with if you're working with girls in STEM." And it just occurred to me, we really need to start this conference off with what do we know? Not just anecdotal information, but what is known through research. So our keynote speaker this morning has been studying research has been doing research in gender differences in career development and outcomes. And I think that's a very appropriate topic for us this morning. She is an associate professor of sociology here at UC Davis, so it's nice to find somebody who didn't have to commute very far. As a matter of fact, she may have actually walked here this morning. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Kimberlee Shauman.
Thank you, Stan. I am really very honored to speak to you all this morning. Sorry, I'm really very honored to speak to you all this morning. It is, it's not something that I ever prepared to do, to speak to people who are in the field out there working with kids. I myself am very much focused on the research, doing analysis of secondary data. I have not collected my own data. I analyze large data sets. And one of the most rewarding parts of my career that has happened since Larry Summers is how much contact I've had with individuals like yourselves and people who are involved in the teaching of science and people who are involved in the doing of science, and that's not something that I had anticipated. So I am very honored to be here to speak to you at this kickoff event. I am going to talk briefly to you this morning about the progress that has been made toward gender equity and equality in participation and achievement in science education. Much of the progress that has been made toward equity in the involvement of women in science careers has been made in the educational part of that whole career trajectory. That's where most of the advances have been made. But still, unfortunately, we have not attained gender equality in science and engineering or math, technology education yet. But fortunately, we have able individuals like yourselves who are working to continue the progress that has been made. I'm going to discuss the progress of women in science and engineering by taking you on a short tour of the beginning part of the career process, the making of a career in science. And along the way, I'm going to stop and highlight what we know about how women are doing relative to men at important parts in this educational process. But before I get going, I need to clarify some terminology. I use the term science as a shorthand for science and engineering or STEM. I use science as a shorthand so I don't have to keep repeating those long terms. So in my slides, you'll see a symbol S, capital S/E, that stands for science and engineering. It's synonymous with STEM. I define scientists and science as including all those who work in the fields of engineering, the physical, biological, mathematical, and computer sciences. I exclude social scientists from that definition, so I exclude myself from that definition of scientists. I do this in order to be compatible with the National Science, most of the National Science Foundation publications. So let's begin our tour by addressing this first question. Why are we interested in the progress of women in science? Besides a whole host of sociological reasons that I could give you, where I started with my research was with an interest in gender equality and inequality in education and labor force participation in general. And science comes up as an interesting case study. But the more I got into looking at science, the more I realized how unique science and engineering education and career development is. So besides all those sociological reasons that I won't bore you with, there's a really strong policy motivation for our study of women in science. As our economy has become increasingly technological and our understanding of health, biology, and nature has advanced, there has been a growing concern about what is perceived as a dearth, a shortage of scientifically trained individuals in this country. Recruiting more women and also underrepresented minorities into science is often proposed as an effective way to expand our pool of talent and thereby increase our supply of scientists and engineers. It's estimated that if the talent for doing science is unrelated to gender, and this is what all of our research actually shows us, that the pool of potential scientists would increase by 60%. So we are underutilizing a huge portion of our talent, our labor force out there. So that's a strong policy motivation besides the motivation for simply promoting gender equity and opportunities in education and labor force participation. Okay, the research that I will cite today And I need to figure out how to make a Mac work. Spacebar. Thank you. The research that I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to talk basically about the progress toward equity. So I'm going to address some of the really commonly held and more strongly held than I had thought previously assumptions about the causes, the explanations for the underrepresentation of women in science and the under-participation of girls in science education. I'm going to look at the quantitative evidence, the empirical evidence regarding those explanations, and then I'll draw some conclusions, and I'll attempt to make some policy recommendations based on our research, but I'm really speaking to the experts, so I'll leave that all to you. The research that I'm talking about today, it comes out of the book that I wrote and published with Yoshia from the University of Michigan, Women in Science, Career Processes and Outcomes. Our study of women in science is motivated by and organized around a life course perspective. What this perspective tells us, it's a theoretical, organizational perspective. It tells us that significant events and transitions in an individual's life are age-dependent, are interrelated, and are contingent but not determined by prior events and earlier experiences. So what this tells us is that to understand the underrepresentation of women in science, we must examine the career trajectory in its entirety. That is, we must examine the influences that affect participation in the educational trajectory that leads to a career in science. That this is the foundation. This is where we have to make sure that girls are getting equal opportunities as our boys and are taking advantage of those opportunities if we are to hope to affect gender equity and participation in the labor force later on. So in the book we take this life course perspective and we study relevant transitions and stages in the educational and career trajectory across the life course. This morning I'm going to be speaking to you about the research that is presented in the first half of the book, that is the research that addresses gender differences in educational attainment and educational achievement through the attainment of master's degrees, so into the graduate level. All right. To do this, we study, to accomplish this sort of life course analysis, we study 17 large nationally representative data sources that look at the population at various points in this process. So to do this, we had to piece together a lot of different data sources. We looked for the most current data at the time. There's more current data that's available now, so updates to the research that I am going to show you today are in the pipeline. Okay, so let's start with a look at gender equity in secondary education. And I'm going to divide my talk into, I'm going to flip back and forth between looking at what the data tells us about gender differences in participation and achievement. Because to affect gender equity over the long haul, girls need to be both participating at equal levels, on equal rates as do young boys and young men, but they also need to achieve. So these are two very intrinsically related pieces to the puzzle about why women are underrepresented in science and engineering. What we know about participation, gender differences in participation, is that over the past 20 years, gender differences in participation in high school coursework patterns have disappeared, and in both math and science. By their senior year in high school, girls and boys are equally likely to complete advanced math and science courses. The only exception to this pattern is in physics. So here we have just the participation rates in various math and science courses. There are no significant differences in the rates of participation by girls and boys as of grade 12, except in physics, where girls are still significantly less likely to take those advanced physics courses. However, so it looks like if we look at participation rates, if we judge participation based on coursework, then we can see that we have pretty much attained gender equity. But if we take aspirations for higher education and science as an indicator of full participation in the science educational trajectory, then sex differences in participation at the secondary level of education really do persist. So looking at high school seniors, And this is data from a cohort of students who were in high school in the mid-1990s. We see that girls are more likely than boys to expect to attend college. So 70% of girls expect to attend college compared to 64% of young men, of boys. But girls are significantly less likely to expect to pursue a science major. So among those individuals who plan to go to college, girls are very significantly less likely to expect to pursue a science major. They are 60% less likely to do so than are boys. Gender gaps in science and math achievement have also closed over the past 10 to 20 years. For many years now, the grades that girls earned in high school science and math courses have rivaled or exceeded those of boys. Yet in contrast to their coursework grades, girls are perennially score lower than boys on standardized tests of math achievement. These significant gender differences fuel speculation that the underrepresentation of women in science is rooted in their lesser achievement. This is the so-called critical filter hypothesis, one variant of which is that which was voiced by Larry Summers. So to test the critical filter hypothesis, we examined gender differences in performance on standardized math achievement tests from 6 different overlapping cohorts of students entering school between 1960 and 1981. And we conclude that the gender gap in average math achievement is small and has been declining. So this mean difference is a measure of what is the difference at the mean of those distributions. A negative indicates that girls are doing less well than boys on average at the mean. And on this scale, a gap, a D of 0.25 is considered small. So what these numbers that I'm showing you here show you is that among that very oldest cohort, the gender gaps were considered substantively small. They're statistically significant because we have very, very large sample sizes. These numbers are based on samples that are in the tens of thousands. So you see that over these cohorts, the gender gap started out small and declined monotonically, so that the last cohort that we look at has a very, very small gender gap in the mean achievement scores. These gender gaps are too small to have any sort of practical explanatory power. They're just too small. All right, so now let's go to what Larry Summers says. Despite the decline in the gender gap in central tendencies, we do find that women are persistently underrepresented amongst the highest achievers on these standardized achievement tests. So that is, we find that in the upper tail of achievement, we find that girls are about half as likely to be in those, to score in among the highest scorers. The metric that we use for identifying that is we look at the the ratio of boys to girls amongst the top 5% of scorers. So if we look at all scores and we look at those who scored in the top 5% of the distribution, girls are about half as likely to be there as boys. They're underrepresented by half. We also find that there's relatively no trend. There's no trend that could be understood in whether this is going up or down. It seems to bounce around depending on the measure that is used. This difference in the representation among the highest achievers was the focus of the recent comments by Harvard University President Larry Summers. He speculated that since high achievement in math is critical for further participation in science education, it must be a strong predictor of who goes on to participate in science and who succeeds in science. So we tested this explanation by examining its influence on the aspiration, on the likelihood that individuals aspire to a college major in science or a science or engineering field. I have to note also that this was published in Chapter 3 of the book when Larry Summers made his comments, and you'll see why I'm frustrated by that. He cited our book when he made his comments. He cited Chapter 2, and in Chapter 3 we refute his argument. So we tested his explanation, and in multivariate analysis, so what we did was we looked at, okay, we did this twice. First of all, we looked at what are the predictors of interest in science, an aspiration for going on to major in science or engineering during college. And we looked at a whole host of different indicators to see if gender differences in any of these indicators could explain the gender gap in the likelihood of aspiring to a science or engineering major. So what we would hope to see here is that, so what the ratio tells us is that the odds that girls aspire to a science or engineering major is only a third of that of boys, 70% less. We would expect that gap to decrease. In other words, we would expect these ratios to increase toward 1 as we control for factors on which girls and boys might differ. So we would expect girls and boys to become more similar if these things that we're controlling for are good predictors. And also, those things that we're controlling for are ones that girls and boys differ on. And we know that girls and boys differ in their likelihood of being one of those top scorers in math and science. But what we find is when we control for both that mean difference in, so just what is the score that these kids are attaining, but also an indicator of whether or not someone was a top achiever. We find that that has no effect on toward explaining the gender gap in aspirations for a science major. We found the same thing for when we looked at who goes on to actually attain a bachelor's degree in science and engineering. In practical terms, what this means is that high achievement is not a good indicator of either interest in or participation in science, in the science educational trajectory. And this is true for both women and men. High achievement doesn't guarantee interest in science, nor does relatively low achievement always deter interest or involvement in science. If we take a moment to think about the complexity of the process, this process of developing aspirations, acting on those aspirations, participating in science, achieving in science, then we shouldn't be surprised by this lack of predictive power. It takes much more than achievement on standardized tests to prompt interest in science, to prompt that action, and to prompt that kind of persistent participation and persistence against many odds and many kind of negative experiences that girls might have. So now let's continue our tour of the science educational trajectory by looking at what we know about gender differences in participation and achievement at the post-secondary level. At the post-secondary educational level, the representation of women has increased significantly in most fields of science and in engineering. Since the early 1970s, when the upswing began, to 2002, which is the most recent year for which the National Science Foundation has released degree attainment data, the representation of women rose from 23 to 57.3% in the biological sciences, from 15 to 41% in the physical sciences, and from 2 to 20% in engineering. These increases are extremely dramatic, and I'll point this out now and reiterate it again. These trends indicate that the so-called problem of women in science is something that is very responsive to changes in policy and changes in practice. This type of movement in a social trend over this period of time is very dramatic. It is rarely seen. The only field for which we see a lack of movement in this graph is in the mathematical and computer sciences. And that we really attribute to the real change in that field. We aggregate those two fields. We probably should disaggregate them. That horizontal line is due to the influx of computer science and the increasing representation of computer science in that category, and the lack of movement, the relative lack of movement of women into that field. Some have argued that women's representation in that field is actually declining or has declined significantly, and there is some evidence to support that. Okay. So there has been remarkable progress toward equal participation in post-secondary science education, but with the exception of the biological sciences, we still have significant gaps. So the upward movement is striking, but the gaps are also striking. Just to draw this out very explicitly, only the biological sciences gets to that 50% mark and actually exceeds the 50% mark, but only the biological sciences do. When we look at the educational process that leads to a bachelor's degree, it is evident that the gender gaps in this fundamental requirement for a career in science, that is a bachelor's degree in science, are the result of gaps early on in the post-secondary educational process. So first, we find that young women are significantly underrepresented among high school students who anticipate pursuing a science major in college or at the university. Second, among those who do express an interest in science or engineering, women are significantly less likely to realize that aspiration than are young men. So for example, if we follow a cohort of individuals, a cohort of students from high school all the way through college, and we did this with 2 consecutive cohorts. I'm showing you the data from the cohort that graduated from high school in 1982. The data follows them for many, many years. We looked at 6 years post-high school graduation. And we find that, so in this graphic we present the sex-specific odds of certain transition rates or proportion representation at each of those stages. We find that among this cohort, young women were half as likely as men to expect to major in science and engineering as in college. And among those who do have that expectation, who do voice that expectation, women were again less than half as likely to go on to actually declare a science or engineering major in that first year of college. However, after the initial disparities at the transition to college, there are no sex differences in persistence to degree past that first year of college. So after that, we see that young women are as likely as young men to persist in their science and engineering majors, and they're slightly more likely, although not significantly so, to attain a degree and to attain their science degree in a timely manner, that is, within 6 years of starting their college. It is also significant to note, and this is what we found by following cohorts, it's very significant to note that young women and young men follow different pathways to the bachelor's degree in science. And this is one area where I feel that the research that we have done has particular policy implications. What we found is that most young women who attain a bachelor's degree in science or engineering actually had expected to pursue a non-science field, a major in a non-science field, or had actually been in a non-science major for some time during their undergraduate careers. So we find that although the rate at which women enter science is significantly lower than it is for men, the vast majority of women are outside of science. That's where the majority of women are. So even if there's a very small rate of transition into a science or engineering field, that transition accounts for a very significant proportion of all the women who ultimately attain a bachelor's degree in science. And we found that among our cohort of students, only 3.7% of all women earned a bachelor's degree in science or engineering. Only 3.7% of this cohort. But among those who do attain that bachelor's degree, 54% of those degrees were earned by women who entered a science major after initially voicing a strong expectation for following a non-science field, or had spent their first year of college in a non-science field and actually had made the transfer into science. This compares to only 32.45% of young men who follow that pathway. So that pathway of entry into science after being somewhat outside of the field is much more common for women. All right, what about the attainment of what happens after the attainment of a bachelor's degree? Are there gender differences in the further involvement, further involvement in the science career trajectory? After attaining a bachelor's degree, an individual might choose to go to graduate school. They might choose to go to graduate school in science or non-science. They might choose to go into the labor force in science or non-science, or they might choose to neither enter graduate school or the labor force. Using National Science Foundation data, we know that the representation of women amongst those individuals who are in graduate school and who are earning graduate degrees have seen the same type of increasing trends as we see at the bachelor's degree level. However, the increase has not been as steep, and the level that is attained is significantly lower at the graduate level, at the master's level, and then you see it shift downward for the doctoral level. So we know that a lot of the potential that is out there amongst those individuals who have invested in their undergraduate training in science and engineering fields and who have attained bachelor's degrees in science and engineering fields, their potential is not being utilized, not being capitalized upon, and these people are not entering graduate school in STEM fields. So why is that? Where do we see the differences and how great are those differences in the post-baccalaureate transitions? This graph presents the female-to-male ratios of the odds of each of these post-baccalaureate career transitions. So any value here that is greater than 1 indicates that women are more likely to make that transition than are men. Anything that's less than 1 shows that women are less likely to make a transition than are men. So what we see is that women are almost 2.5 times more likely than men to, you might call it dropping out, neither entering graduate education or the labor force. So they're 2.4 times more likely to make that transition after attaining their bachelor's degree in a STEM field. So this is only among those individuals who have a bachelor's degree in a science or engineering field. Among those who don't drop out of education or the labor force, women and men are equally likely to make the transition either to graduate school or to the labor force. But within each of these tracks, graduate school or the labor force, women are less than half as likely as men to pursue a science or engineering field. So, and remember that this is among those individuals who have already made a significant investment in their education, and they represent a pool of potential that is not being utilized ultimately for our endeavor of science in this country. So I have shown you some kind of a brief statistical picture of where males and females are differing in this early career process, the process of education in science and engineering. So probably you're all thinking, what are the explanations? So I want to start out by first reiterating where we don't find empirical support for certain commonly held explanations. First, the coursework hypothesis. This posits that the underrepresentation and underachievement of young women in science is explained by gender differences in high school coursework participation and certain preparation prior to entry into college and university. We find no significant differences in coursework, so this cannot be a cause of the differences in participation after high school, after graduation from high school. Furthermore, we find that women who participate in science and engineering majors are quite successful. They are attaining their bachelor's degrees at increasing rates. So this attainment tells us that we should see more participation in the labor force. But again, we're seeing there that the preparation is happening, but the utilization is not happening. Second, the critical filter hypothesis holds that women are less likely to succeed in science education and employment because of chronic female deficits in mathematics achievement. We found that sex differences in mean achievement have declined, but that sex differences in the attainment of very high achievement persist. But we find that in multivariate analysis, neither the small differences in mean achievement nor the more significant differences in high achievement help explain the gender gap in the likelihood of either interest in participation in science and math education or in achievement of those credentials at the bachelor's level. We do find support for more broad, more comprehensive, and frankly, more messy explanations. So one of the themes of the book is that simple explanations are really not cutting it. This isn't a simple process. We can't expect simple explanations to help us understand why girls are underrepresented and women are underrepresented in STEM fields. So we first find support that there is a supply problem, no surprise to all of you. The flow of women into science is restricted, and this hampers both their participation and some argue their performance at all levels. Second, the segregation of men and women into different science fields and different educational sequences helps us understand the gender gaps in some of the transitions that I've shown you. Third, parenthood still has a disproportionately negative effect on women's participation in science and engineering education and ultimately in the labor force too. So the supply problem is evident in many places in the science and education, the science educational trajectory. In most fields, and biology is the exception here, the supply of women interested in entering science is very low. Even young women who excel in science and math achievement and course participation during high school do not choose to pursue science at the same rate as equally and frankly less qualified young men. Women who have made the significant investment in their human capital and have attained a degree in science, both at the bachelor's level and at the master's level, are less likely than men to utilize this human capital, either by going on to get further education in a graduate program or in the labor market. The segregation of men and women by field and by educational track help explain some of the gender gaps that we see in participation and achievement. For example, among the students enrolled in science and engineering courses in colleges and universities, women tend to be very, very significantly overrepresented in courses that are peripheral to the actual major, the track in the major. And they're overrepresented in courses that do not facilitate movement into the major or lead to the educational experiences that would make these individuals competitive for admissions into graduate programs. An examination of the organization of the physical science coursework at the University of Michigan revealed by the physicists themselves, by the physics professors themselves, I note, this examination revealed that women were enrolling and doing very well in physics courses that were meant to satisfy general education requirements, but these courses were not structured to act as a bridge into the major. They were actually somewhat, they could be characterized as terminal. They're terminal courses. You take that course, and then if you actually do want to major in science, you have to go back and redo that course in another track so that then you could be in the major track. Third, another example of this is how engineering schools are structured as separate from the rest of the campus, and that you need to know ahead of time in high school to apply to these programs in order to enter those programs and get a degree in a timely manner. So that type of structure should be re-examined and questioned about whether that really needs to be and how we might generate those bridges that would facilitate the movement of young women and underrepresented minorities into these fields. Finally, parenthood has a disproportionately negative effect on women's participation and achievement in science. And you might wonder why I even include this in a talk about just education, the educational part of this career, because where we really feel it, right, is when we're actually in the labor force or once we've had children, and that happens later in life, certainly after high school and for most of us after college. But long before women experience the work-family conflict firsthand, they attempt to manage the situation. So the perception that a career in science is particularly difficult to combine with family roles, however true or untrue that might be, has a really significant effect. It sets up a significant barrier to the real embracing of science and engineering as a potential career path for young women. Again and again and again in surveys and research that looks at the aspirations of young women, we hear women voice this again and again and again. I don't think that I can do science or engineering because I want to have a family. So they're set up as things that are incompatible. And the perception of the conflict is not a false one. Women who have children are much less likely to pursue careers in science after completing their education. For example, among the science baccalaureates who enter the labor force, and this is from data on a whole series of cohorts entering the labor force in the 1980s and 1990s, we see that among those individuals who have already attained a bachelor's degree in science, mothers are 60% less likely than fathers to enter science occupations. Among the science baccalaureates who enter graduate school, mothers are 89% less likely than fathers to enter science degree programs. So this conflict is real even during the educational trajectory. In conclusion, I want to reiterate that the data show that girls and women have made really significant progress toward equal representation, equal participation, and equal achievement in science and engineering. And again, that these trends, this really significant changes, indicate that this process toward gender equity, everything that we're doing to promote women's participation at all levels in science and engineering, education, and the labor force has had a significant effect. This is a problem that is one that can be addressed through policy change and change in practice. But the research also shows again and again that there's a lot of work to be done. There are significant differences between girls and boys in their participation and achievement. So the research shows us that the potential that girls and women possess is being underutilized. This failure to realize women's potential is detrimental both to their own career outcomes and I would argue to their fulfillment, or at least to their ability to have a real range of options. But it is also detrimental to the endeavor of science in this country because of all that potential that is not being utilized. The explanations for these differences, the explanations for why young women are not participating at the same rate as young men are not simple ones, and neither therefore will be the solutions that will bring about further progress toward equity. Continued progress will require both institutional and interpersonal change. At the institutional level, our research shows that programs really need to be aimed at recruiting women. We have had a lot of success with programs that have been aimed at retaining women in science. Once they're identified as being interested, there's a lot of programs, particularly at the undergraduate level in colleges and universities, to retain these women in these programs. And we see the success there in the gender equity in that persistence to degree amongst the cohort that I showed you. But the majority of the women are outside of science, and we need to really start looking at the programs that have been successful at recruitment, either prior to post-secondary education, during secondary education, but also we need to start looking at recruitment that can happen through programs and through changes in educational structures, the organization of our majors in the post-secondary level. Also, greater attention and credence should be given to young girls' concerns about the conflict between family and work. We need to identify just how this conflict occurs, and we need to highlight the great success of the many individuals, both male and female, who have successfully managed the challenge of combining successful full careers in science and engineering with also very, very happy family lives and full family lives. So I consider you the real experts on how to bring about the needed changes that have to continue into the future. And I appreciate your efforts on behalf of my two daughters, too, who are 6.5 and 2.5. And I hope that your efforts will make the educational system and the career system such that they really do have a full range of opportunities and choices to be made. Thank you.
Of community colleges, since especially in California so many girls go through that route?
You know, I have not, and that is one area of research that I think people have started to look at. I don't know of research on how community colleges fit into this whole process in terms of STEM education. So I don't know, but it is an area that I think really needs to be addressed. My own experience in teaching statistics is that I see real differences between the students who are coming in as transfer students from JCs and from community colleges and in how they report having been taught statistics in their JCs. It's a small sample, and I haven't done any systematic analysis on it, but I think that that's a really interesting area of research, and it's one that really needs to be explored as a structure that could be used to as a feeder, as one of those bridges, getting girls and underrepresented minorities involved with real hands-on education so that they are prepared. The challenge will be making sure that they are ramped up enough to be for themselves to feel like they can be real participants in their majors once they make the transition to a four-year college or university.
That's a number of your data sets just went through 1980-81. What happened to data in the last 25 years?
When we were doing the analysis for the book, this is, indicative of the process that it takes to actually get the book going. We had the cohorts that we were looking at that were in that entered college in the 1990s hadn't yet finished. So we did analyses for as long as for them, covering how much of their college career they had completed. But when it came to actually degree attainment, we had to go back to the 1980s data. Now the waves of the data for the cohorts that entered college in 1992, and then there's new data sources for cohorts that completed their education in 1994. So there's new data sets that have been made available which could be used to look at these same questions. Some of those data are really ideal because they have detailed information on the majors that the individuals were involved in. Others not so much. They're not so useful because they didn't collect detailed information on what the majors were, and they didn't survey the kids all the way through. So this was the most complete data that we had at the time, but it is unsatisfying because we want to know what's happening more currently.
You talked about the supply problem, that young women simply are coming into post-secondary education not interested in STEM sort of careers and such. A number of studies trace this back to 6th and 7th grade, where we begin losing girls' interest in math and science. Those focus on numbers, on the statistics of how many kids we begin to lose. Are you aware of any research that focuses on the reasons for that, other than some of the later ones you've discussed about family versus work and those kinds of things? Are there systemic things that we're doing in elementary school that are beginning to create this loss in 6th and 7th grade?
The research that I'm aware of, and this is a huge body of research, but the research on that period of the life course and the research that focuses on the reasons why, not just how much, but why, have shown that what comes to mind are two main explanations. One has to do with the lack of experiential learning. So there's research on gender differences in the ways that girls and boys like to learn. And there's the classic studies about cooperative learning versus competitive, the need for hands-on learning and things like that. In the realm of science, the research that I know of shows that this is particularly important for the continued excitement and involvement of girls, their interest in science and engineering, that they are more likely to appreciate this education if they're doing more hands-on learning. They're also more likely to appreciate it and their interest to be developed and persist if they are shown the real-world applications of the knowledge, so that more theoretical, very formalized teaching doesn't work well for continuing girls' interest. That they need to see how this is going to be useful. They need to know who's going to benefit from this. So those are the two big ones that I can think of. And then there's stuff on classroom practices that are applicable across all fields, not just science and engineering.
It would be good to expand on race, culture to women, and how that's influencing. I noticed you talked about the familial gender roles, family influence. Is that prevalent more of discouraging women to go into,
across different racial groups, racial or ethnic groups?
Yeah.
I don't have research on that, so I would not want to speak to that. I know that there's a lot of assumptions out there and myths about that the influence of family in another way, like family roles and the real expectation of kids' involvement with the family and closer attachment of girls than boys. That's a stereotype of Hispanic families that might work against the involvement of Hispanic girls, but I don't have any numbers on that, so I wouldn't want to speculate on that. Yeah, on the plus side for minorities, it's kind of a, double-edged sword. But college-going behavior and the expectation of college-going behavior is so much greater amongst girls, African American girls and Hispanic American girls, than it is amongst boys. The problem there is it's almost a extreme example of what I've shown you here. You know, if you want to look at gender differences just among Hispanic Americans or African Americans, the girls and the young women are there. They're going to college in so much greater numbers than are the males from their communities. It's really about involving them in science and engineering. So they're there. They need to be recruited. Whereas the problem is much more significant for African American and Hispanic males. They're not there in college. They're not there in the college preparatory tracks. And their aspirations are not the same to go to college. So much more work needs to be done in terms of involvement of underrepresented minorities if we want to make sure that there's gender equity there too. Yeah.
2 more questions.
Okay, I was wondering, are you aware of any data available on either inequities in the number or nature of employment opportunities post-grad?
In terms of, yes, there's a whole 45 minutes of a talk about the labor force. Yes. So let me give one answer to the general question that you voiced. So we do see very significant gender differences in the transition to the labor force amongst those individuals who have education in science and engineering fields. And so there's an even greater drop-off. So it is this idea that, the pool is somewhat large and it gets whittled down and whittled down. Part of those gender differences in the participation in science, again, can be brought back to the same general explanations that I presented here. For instance, segregation plays a big part in explaining gender differences in labor force participation in science and engineering fields and in pay and promotion rates, because women are very concentrated in the biological sciences. And the biological sciences have one of the lowest rates of transition to graduate school and also one of the lowest rates of transition to the labor force. Not just because it's female dominated, it has the lowest rate of transitions amongst men in those fields also. It is just a field that is very diverse and provides a lot of different employment opportunities, so there's a lot of loss from that core science, the labor force that is actually practicing science. And it's also one of the lowest paid fields, and it's also one of the fields where the promotion rates seem to be particularly low for individuals all around. In comparison to, say, engineering, where males are overrepresented and women are very severely underrepresented, where that has one of the highest rates of transition from degree attainment to the labor force, and nice steady rates of promotion and relatively high pay. So some of the same explanations apply when we look at the transition from education to the labor force also. Does that answer your question enough? Okay.
Last question. Yes.
What is your sample population?
So these are all different samples, but they're all nationally representative samples. So they're not from a particular state or anything, or a particular school. They are nationally representative. So the findings speak to the population as a whole, given a certain, within high school or within college. Okay.
Okay, we're going to have to end right now. Thank you very much.